We read each week, usually, from this book, Rays of the One Light, which are parallel commentaries on the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita, written by Swami Kriyananda, based on the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. For the past few weeks, for various reasons, we haven't been reading from the book because we've had other special occasions. And when I started to look at this week's reading, it depends or refers to last week's reading. So today, for the price of one, you get two readings. So the first one is entitled, How Democratic is Truth? Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. We live in an age when people assume that knowledge should be available equally to all. In matters susceptible of judgment by normal common sense, however, everyone knows there are exceptions. Access to a control room for intercontinental missiles is limited by universal consent to a very few. Access to the controls of a passenger airliner is limited to those with the necessary knowledge for operating them, and also to those with the proper authorization. If people don't see the disadvantages of making more subtle knowledge universally available, it is only because they are ignorant of the risks involved. In the case of subtle knowledge, the main disadvantage in making it universally available is the harm it might do to one who isn't ready for it, and who might even mock it. True, by mocking truth, he might undermine the faith of a few truth seekers. But then, such tests can also be beneficial as a means of strengthening faith. Again, true, the clever doubter's misrepresentation of those truths may dissuade a few seekers from following the spiritual path. But if a seeker is really sincere, he will recognize the truth eventually because it resonates with his own being. No, the greatest problem accrues to the shallow doubter himself. To give him an opportunity to affirm his ignorance might only estrange him even more from the truth, delaying the time when he will turn, as all people must eventually, to the light. Thus, the scriptures advise not secrecy, but discretion in the sharing of truth. Jesus Christ says in the Gospel of St. Matthew, Give not that which is holy unto dogs, neither cast ye your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet, and turn again and rend you. And Sri Krishna says in the 18th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, Never speak of these truths to one who is without self-control or devotion, who renders no service, who does not care to hear, or who speaks ill of me. Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind. And here's the next reading. Now, does God hide the truth? Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. In last week's reading, which we heard a few seconds ago, we saw that the great masters themselves counseled discretion in the dissemination of truth. The counter-argument is sometimes made, but the Lord doesn't hide. He reveals His beauty in the sunsets, His tender sympathy in the rain, His wrath in the thunder, His restless energy in the brooks, His power in the sunlight. There are exoteric truths, and there are also esoteric truths. There is that which is revealed impersonally and left up to us to interpret, such as the thunder and our perception of it as divine wrath, the rain and our perception of it as God's sympathy. But behind even God's most open expressions, there lies impenetrable mystery. The wind blows where it wills, said Jesus in the Gospel of St. John. You hear the sound of it, but you do not know where it comes from or where it is going. So is everyone who is born of the Spirit. And Krishna says in the 9th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, "By me the whole vast universe of things is spread abroad, by me, the unmanifest. In me are all existences contained, not I in them." God's hidden reality cannot be understood by the reasoning faculty. India's Sankhya philosophy states frankly, Ishwar Ashiddha. God is not provable. A willingness to seek the underlying reality behind appearances is essential for those who would know God. Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind. Om, Om, Om. It is a good question to consider of this, why isn't truth made universally available, and in fact should it be made universally available, especially as it relates, of course, to the spiritual path. And in this day and age of spreading much more information to everyone, especially through the internet, this becomes a very relevant question. Whenever I'm in a conversation with someone and we're talking about something like, oh, do you remember there was that one movie where the thing happened with the guy and there was an airplane, and yeah, what, I know what it is, and but who was the actor or what was the name of it? Sometimes we joke and say, how would we ever find out? You know, the phone is right there. It's a Wonderful Life, yes, and Frank Capra, and you get all the answers right there. There's almost no informational question that you can't answer with Google or with Wikipedia or something like that. So, I mean, I don't even know if we can even remember back to the day when we didn't know stuff. You see, the phone makes it so easy to know stuff. You just have a question, especially some kind of informational thing, like, something about Omar Khayyam, did he, blah, blah, blah. You just look it up. Oh, yes, it says here anything. Plus the weather and other things. But in terms of knowledge, pretty much anything you want to get in terms of information, you can get. And so then we start saying, dear Google, how can I be happier? Well, you get advice even from Google that way, it's true. Although in Ananda's church in Palo Alto, which is the heart of Silicon Valley and about 1 mile away from Google's headquarters, it says, how does it say it? Google can't answer every search, or something like that. I'm not stating it perfectly, but something like that. Google can't provide the answer to every search, or something like that. It says a banner there. And so, in terms of all of this, we get information now quite easily, and that's good. Part of this desire that, or feeling that knowledge should be available equally to everyone is partly in response to a time when knowledge wasn't available equally to everyone. And all you have to see, especially in this country, is the difference that education makes. A little bit of education makes a huge difference in someone's life. I met a man in Gurgaon, in Big Bazaar. This is when Dharmini and I had just moved to Gurgaon. This was in 2006. And so we were shopping for things to fill the house with, and so it was a room. But so the room in a house, that with things and so on. And this man said to me, I was trying to practice Hindi, and so I said something like, aap kaise hain, and so on. And he said, sir, I love English. And so I said, yes, kya hal hai? I was trying to practice it. He said, I am no English. And I said, no, your English is good. And he said, I want English. Then he said, English is life. And it was a little poignant for me. It touched my heart. Not because I love English, although I like it, But because he was trying to say, or I felt he was expressing the truth, especially in Gorgon, to the extent that you know English, to the extent that you can rise very quickly in the society. An English-speaking taxi driver can do much better than someone who doesn't. And it's just a simple language, and mostly it's just understanding left, right, straight, please slow down. You know, that's really, I mean, there's a limited number of phrases you have to get, but still, I felt a little bit of sadness just saying, gosh, couldn't we just spread all knowledge to all people who want it so they can have that opportunity? Because education is such a key. And yet, once you have an education, and a good education, still there's some hunger there for more. I had this great education, but it didn't tell me everything I wanted to know. And this is natural. In other words, we need to go forward from where we are. So if we're in a situation where we're struggling to learn something that will then help us to be, say, more functional in the world, that's where we should put our energy. But if we've gotten to a place where that's not a problem, I can do all that, but still I'm not satisfied, then we need more knowledge. And which is to say, true knowledge, which doesn't come from information, but come from books, come from information, it comes from experience. You can't really say you know a thing until you've experienced it. You can be the master of all the recipes for sambar. You can know the first sambar that was ever created back in 5 billion BC. And you can say all about how it tastes like, but until you've tasted it, you can't actually know what you're talking about. And so in terms of also the spiritual path coming out of, not often the desire for truth, the desire for the spiritual path, the desire for God comes out of suffering. And why is that? Some people sort of, it's not fair, and why should we have to suffer? And we don't have to suffer. And the spiritual path is not a path of suffering, meaning that it's required. But somehow it manages to come in anyway. And the suffering comes from because we don't get what we want. And I don't mean that lightly, because it can be very heartbreaking. And that was part of what put me on the spiritual path, as my heart was broken. And then I began to wonder, what am I missing? There's something missing, because if I were smart enough, I would have known not to pursue this course that ended in disaster. But I wasn't smart enough, because I happily charged through. And so what can I learn? What's the missing component? I sort of have all of these different axes and components and variables. I was very mathematical in my approach, filled in. But there's something still missing, because it was like z was equal to 0 and the whole thing exploded. And what's z? I don't know about this z thing, this other variable. And so that's what led me to the spiritual path, was that suffering. And so it also sometimes, though, suffering can happen not because of a big outward disaster. A friend of mine got the perfect husband for her, the perfect job, the perfect house. They had enough success. They got their first house. This was in the US. They moved into the house and they had planned it all exactly, that this should be there and this should be there. And then after everything was all done, she sat down in the kitchen and wanted to cry, because she said, I have finally everything. And this is it. This is all it is? I could turn on the water and there it goes. I can plug in the thing and there it works. But so what? If I have a headache, none of this cures the headache. If I feel sad, none of it cheers me up. Is this really all that there is in life? And so again, before you have some of those things, it's right and natural to be working and growing in that direction. So it's useless to say to somebody who's struggling to reach a level of basic comfort in life that you have, to say to them, listen, when you get it, it's not going to be any good. Listen, that's their direction of expansion, and let them. We have to learn by our own, not only experiences, but our own discoveries. We have to make these conclusions ourselves. We can't just be told. It helps a lot if we are told things that are true and we believe them, if only, and again, we believe them so that we try out to see if they're true. That is important. I don't mean don't listen to anything, but I mean understand and respect. Everyone has the right to approach truth in their own way and in their own time, and they will. That statement is made that even the clever doubter will eventually turn towards the truth, as all people must. And we might ask ourselves, well, I mean, must we? I mean, is it obvious that everyone must turn toward the light? Now, if we go back also to the statement of the Shankya philosophy, Ishvara Siddha, God is not provable. And so, we have to understand these things in the right way. When India's teachings first were translated and reached the West recently, which means in the 1800s, starting in the 1700s and then going into the 1800s and 1900s. Interestingly, the United States of America was founded in 1776, and 10 years later, the first English translation of the Bhagavad Gita appeared. And so there's some kind of something that why so close together and right at that time. And there's such an openness to the teachings of the Gita in America especially, but certainly in the West in general. Only because they love Krishna? Well, maybe. But also because it's just true. The things you read, it's just true. The balanced man is not he who eats too much or eats too little, who sleeps too much or sleeps too little. All these things you kind of go, yeah. And it's not trivial, because when you're working too hard and not getting any sleep and feeling rather proud, well, that's okay, I work hard, I suffer. Krishna says, don't sleep too little. Why? Because eventually you collapse and then you're no good to anybody. And so it's like you've got to pace yourself. You have to. And also, if you're doing too much, it may be because you think God isn't doing anything. Get God's help in all this. Get other people's help. Sometimes it shows that it's like, listen, you need to learn how to delegate or how to invite friends or so on. I'm not saying it to anybody, but I'm just saying, in other words, the solution isn't always just to do more or to have 2 bodies or to have 5 minutes of sleep a night. It may be to expand your circle. And sometimes we do get in these situations and there's nothing to do but march. And that's fine. But you can march for a week, maybe 2 weeks, maybe a month, but not forever. And because you can't burn through your reserves that way. I mean, you can, but then you don't want to, believe me. You'll find out on the other side. So, it's something to just keep in mind, that these teachings have to be understood correctly. So when these translations appeared, Ishwar Asiddha, it was translated as God is not proved. Not provable, but proved. God is not proved. And so the rational mind, or the rational Western commenter on this thing said, oh, God is not proved. It means the philosophy is atheistic. They don't believe in God. Why? Because he's not proved. You can't prove God. Proves he doesn't exist. Just like, oh my gosh. Because even to think of a level of thought beyond logic was a bit of a stretch. God is not proved, in this case really is saying, as it said there, God is not provable. You cannot arrive at God through logic. Why? Because it's a convenient argument against anyone else. Anyone says anything, well, what about this? You can't arrive at God through logic. Well, what about that? I mean, the population is increasing, but where are the extra souls coming from, if reincarnation is true? You can't arrive at God through logic. You can't do that. You have to try to answer people in terms of their own questions, in terms that are fair for them. You can't just pull the rug out the whole time. You might as well just go, God, 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 God. I'm not listening to your negative doubts. Actually, that would be a good practice to do. If somebody is just too negative, just paklam. Just keep your distance. But in terms of God is not provable at a level, why do we say that? Because logic is a lower level of arriving at understanding. How do we know? Logic is espoused by the scientists, that it's the ultimate way of finding truth. And I agree. that it is a very good way, and I was raised in science and mathematics, and I understand and accept the great value of these things. But look at every scientific breakthrough that has happened, just about. They have happened by inspiration. Einstein, the theory of relativity, the speed of light is constant. He suddenly had a vision of himself traveling at the speed of light and saw that if he looked at other light waves, which let's not even get into whether it's a particle or a wave, he would see light as a standing wave, meaning it was standing still. And he realized the speed of light had to be constant. Don't ask me to explain it because I can't. But then it took him 10 years to connect the present understanding of physics to make a logical argument as to why this should be the case. But that was not how he came up with it. It was inspiration. It was not logic. The transistor, which runs everything, computers, digital, was discovered, I believe, by accident. They just did something in AT&T and they had some tube and then somebody broke something and then something, oh, look at that. I don't mean like it created a transistor, but the principles behind it were discovered by accident, which you could also call divine inspiration. But it wasn't some logical thing. So in other words, even the masters of logic, you will find sometimes in very clever reasoning that there is a big leap all of a sudden that seems logical. If you've ever worked on math problems and you've had to figure out a puzzle or something, there's usually one leap that is logical but was not at all obvious. Like, wow, how did you... Okay, I see that that's true, but how did you come up with that? You see, there's a big step. And so logic pretends to be very fancy, but it's only kind of fancy. Inspiration, intuition is much more powerful. And usually the people who criticize intuition and these kinds of things in favor of logic don't realize that they're heroes. The masters of science and logic all really loved inspiration. Einstein at one point was objecting to Niels Bohr. These are Niels Bohr is a physicist who was talking about quantum mechanics and saying how, a lot of it is probabilistic. And Einstein said, God does not play dice. And he was saying, look, it's not random. God is behind everything. God is a reality. And so you can't just say, oh, it was all just kind of random things. Niels Bohr said, don't tell God what to do. That was his response. It was a little, snide. I'm sure he said, sir, gee, because it's Einstein. I mean, my God. But he was saying, don't tell God what to do. But I think really the point he was missing was you can describe this behavior using dice and probability, but that doesn't mean that's actually how it's manifested. It's just a good way to think about it. It's a good working model. All of science, all of life, in how we proceed in our lives, we have kind of a working model of what life is about, and then occasionally some new information comes or some new slap on the head comes and we say, ow, must learn to look behind me for the frying pans that are coming at me. There's something missing from the model. Let's adjust the model and so on. That's how we learn. And therefore, the frying pan on the head, or I should say the tawa on the head, or the different sufferings that we have are bringing us new understanding. I don't mean to, again, say that uncompassionately. Of course, we have to feel patient with ourselves, and we also have to have compassion for others and just say, well, it's bringing you new understanding. Yeah, here, you want a Kleenex? Tissue for, just like, look, that doesn't show any understanding on that person's part. So, and that's true. I mean, I think this even happened, how there was a little girl at Ananda village in the early days who fell off her bike and scraped her knees and was sitting on the ground crying, and one of the new yogis came and sat down next to her and said, well, you have to understand, circumstances are always neutral. It's our reaction to them that, just like, come on, just help her with Band-Aids and you give her something to drink and, comfort you, just come on. So, but on the other hand, it is the mark of a new yogi or a new truth seeker who has to constantly tell everyone about the good news. Now, on the other hand, it's very good. Why? Why? I did the same thing. Why? And I sometimes still do. Because it has made me so happy. And it has made me so much more effective in my life that, of course, I want to share that with everyone. Those of you who have seen Finding Happiness, the movie, there was a small scene in the movie that I was in, and we, of course, filmed it many times. And the way and I don't mean many times because I kept messing up, but it was, we filmed it many times because the whole film was actually done not with a script, in the sense that it sort of had a script, and it definitely had topics that you were supposed to cover. But people, when they were trying to memorize their lines, were coming out and saying, "Hello, my name is Dharmarajan, and I'm very glad to meet you." You know, it's just like, you don't have to memorize lines about yourself. I mean, you could as well just do it. So people couldn't be actors, but they could just then be themselves. So anyway, there was sometimes different conversations that happened that didn't end up in the movie. And the director was just saying, go with it. And it was partly his great skill and artistry and devotion for all of what he was doing that was able to bring out the best in everybody. The great thing, one of the things that made that movie work, and if you haven't seen it, I hope you do see it soon, was Swamiji's vision of the movie and how it could work, which interestingly, when his idea finally came out, a lot of people objected to it. I myself just went, how is this going to work? And then you see the movie and you just say, as always, Swamiji was right. He saw the whole thing from the beginning, but it took us a while to understand how this could work. And the director really loved Ananda, but was not a part of Ananda at all. And so that was another wonderful aspect, that he could be outside, so he could bring that perspective of a new person and a fresh look, and sort of keeping in mind, okay, how could you introduce me to all of these things without, because sometimes when you're so close to something you can't see it. And it would be hard, as sometimes we have here, where people will say, so what are these teachings? Yoganandaji, Babaji, Kriya Yoga, you know, what are these teachings? And sometimes people will just say, it's wonderful. You know, it's hard to really like, well, what is it? Sunday, 10 a.m. You just come. In fact, one of our friends recently said that. I met one of his friends who came to level 1 and was kind of, respectful and open, but watching and, thinking a lot, which is fine. But later, when he left, I said to the common friend of ours, who's a Kriyaban, I said, "Oh, I got to meet your friend so-and-so." He said, "Yes, theoretician. He is the great theoretician. He's always debating, arguing, questioning. I just said, you come on Sunday, 10 a.m. You see for yourself that you ask the questions directly if you have so many questions." It's good. It's good to ask questions. I'm not at all discouraging that at all. How else do we know? But it's not good to ask questions mindlessly. That's the thing. People asking questions will often accuse, you don't want to be mindless, just following all this thing and om, and all that. Don't you want to know why? Don't you need to know the reason? And all these things. And yet, you can just as easily mindlessly ask questions. Why? 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 You know, young children, you're like 7, sit down. Why? Because you need to know. Why? And you realize it's just why. And that it goes forever. And then you think, ha, they grow out of it. They don't always. Sometimes they can be 40 years old. Why? Meaning mindlessly. You can ask why thoughtfully, intelligently. What's the difference? There's positive doubt and negative doubt. Positive doubt questions with the assumption that there is an answer. Negative doubt questions with the assumption that there isn't an answer, and is only trying to break down everything without any positive hope. That's the difference between positive doubt and negative doubt. So in other words, if we need to be understanding of the truth. If we don't understand something or we want to know why, we need to question it. We need to deepen that. No problem with that. But we have to say from the beginning, as it emphasized in the reading, What's the appearance? What's the hidden reality behind appearances? Step 1 and 2, 3, and all the way to the end. All the steps. The center of the spiritual path is, I want to know what is true. You have to care what is true. And you do. But I'm saying, if you don't care what is true, then we can do anything we want. It doesn't matter if it's true or not. And if you meet someone who isn't yet at the point of actually caring whether something is actually true impersonally, beyond even opinion, then, talk as much as you can, do as much as you can. It might be better to give them a few muraka and jalebi and, bring comfort that way. Because on a mental level, until we're guided to say, is it true or not, then there's nothing we can really do. And I don't mean that, again, our lives should be spent trying to convert others or anything like that. But I mean, when you're in an argument with someone, or if someone is really pushing doubts on you, and you realize they're just trying to show off their cleverness, then say, you're very clever, wonderful. And then later, but it can shake us a little bit, as it said in the reading, and the reading emphasized, to be shaken is good. It helps you to become stronger. You can always remember Master's statement. Before I say the statement, in reference to that statement, I was in the PhD program at MIT, and there are a lot of smart people there. And so we were not very often debating these things, because I was too shy. I didn't want to, partly shy, but also I just didn't want to expose something that was so precious to me. I didn't want to expose it to ridicule and, rational argument and so on, and these things. In fact, one of the guys was a very tall Russian guy, and he was very smart, incredible, and he's gone on to do great things. But he was, someone had proved some nice theorem on the board, and he said, not so bad actually. And I had some moment of bravery, and I said, not so bad actually? That's like the highest praise you can, look at what he did. And you're saying not so bad actually? And he just smiled, and luckily didn't have his baseball bat or whatever. But then one time when I finally announced I was leaving, and they knew I was a part of this spiritual thing, and that I was going to go off to California and be a part of Ananda, he said, so, why you meditate? And, again, remember, he's very tall, so I'm not. And I just didn't want to say, because I love God, because I want to find God, all these things which were the truth. But it's just, And I said, it helps me to think more clearly, which is very true. He said, not so bad, actually. And maybe I should learn to meditate, just like, wow. Because again, everybody wants to think more clearly. So, at MIT, with all of these things, like I was saying, people were very much using logic and so on, and being very clever. And when you came across someone who was cleverer, it was just like, God, so smart. And then they could even, again, the cleverest person can find holes in your reasoning for even why you love God. It's possible. And so this clever person, but I would always, gosh, I'm not clever enough. And then I heard this recording of Masters that I was referring to, where he said, he is the cleverest who finds God. And if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. If that's where we're all going, briefly, because as the Sankhya philosophy states, everything is vibration. God manifested the universe by vibrating himself. And so that's where we get duality from. And that if he vibrated everything out of himself, it means he vibrated Prem and Napoleon and Vinit and everybody here out of himself, out of himself. And then because of duality, if it has gone out, they are going to have to return. So that is why everyone eventually is going to return to God. And so I don't mean you say it to everybody necessarily. You know what? You're going back to God. Doesn't matter how much you doubt and complain and ridicule. People hate that. Because, again, it's like pulling the rug out from under them. Just as much as we may hate their doubts, on the other hand, they hate it when you try to say we can't have an intelligent conversation about this. So you have to balance it, though. Is the conversation really intelligent? Okay, you can wonder. But anyway, so that was the thing about MIT. He is the cleverest who finds God. But when we go back to, I should finish my story about the movie. I'm sorry, I realize I'm kind of going all over the place. So the thing about the movie, because I was saying, why would we want to even talk to people about these things? I was saying it was the mark of a new devotee who's always trying to convert everybody to the truth. And on the one hand, that's not respectful of people's own right to come to it just in the way that you came to it. You probably didn't come to it because somebody was haranguing you, unless it was a husband or wife who said, please come along, to the level 1. We'll often get that. Why are you here? Oh, I read Autobiography of a Yogi for 10 years ago. I was so glad to finally find this place. Sir, why are you here? Oh, my wife made me come. Or it's vice versa. But still, it's good, lucky you. You didn't have to go through all that. So, in any case, we want to share something that has brought us so much joy. It's natural and actually right that we do so. And so in this movie, I was walking back and forth with the actress, because that was the scene. We were supposed to walk along this little path, and then they, walk back and so on. And so as we were walking, we had said whatever we were supposed to say. The director said, just talk. And so she was excellent. She's an excellent actress. But she also was very good at sort of being in character and sort of like, being present. So if you said something, she didn't go, yeah, what's the next line? She was just there and just taking it naturally. And so she said, we were talking about the different communities and their locations and so on. And so she said, is anyone welcome to visit your communities? And I said, if we found something that's brought us so much joy, why wouldn't we want to share it with everyone else? I mean, that's just what came out of my mouth. The director said, that's it, say that again. So then it was like, what did I, if we have found, no, I'm kidding. So then we had to go back, and then we had to walk again, and so we're walking, and they push the camera in like this, and so it's right on. I'm just like, and so she said that, and I said the same thing. If we found something that brought us so much joy, why wouldn't we want to share it with everyone? And when I came out of that, the producer, who was Italian, said, "Good actor." And I just thought, you're not acting when you're playing yourself. He's an excellent man, Roberto Bessi. He's a wonderful man. But it was very sweet, because it's a part of who we are. And why wouldn't we want to share it with everyone? But we have to use discretion. This thing, don't cast your pearls before swine, lest they trample them, turn about and rend you, which means to cut you. And swine with horns and so on, and can do that. And so we often, you could think that, don't cast your pearls before swine, and people say, who are you calling a swine? Just like, swine are pigs, by the way. And so it's not as the reading says, because we say, swine! And keep that in mind, because often people do. So don't ever let that enter your heart, swine. Don't, because it doesn't help you. The problem is, it hurts the people themselves. It hurts the doubter themselves. Now, why? How? In fact, in related question, Swamiji would often say that it is harmful to tell someone a truth that they're not prepared to hear. Now that may take a little thinking, because we can certainly understand how, okay, if they're not ready to hear it, it's fine for them not to hear it. But why would it actually be worse for them to hear it? I mean, if they're just not ready. I mean, if you're not ready to hear, Yugoslavian, and then someone speaks to you in Yugoslavian, it doesn't do you any harm. You just kind of go, Teriade, Puila, I don't know, I don't get it, so fine, it's okay. But in the case of these things, it can be harmful. Why? First, just suppose you have somebody who's really restless, and you say, you ought to meditate. And they try to meditate, and they're, like me, when I was first trying to meditate, just so restless. And they try it, and they hate it. And then later, Maybe when they found different ways to kind of center their energy, now you say you should try to meditate. Oh, I tried that, it doesn't work. Or if you say, listen, you really want to be happy inside. Nah, I can't be happy inside. Look at all these problems outside. You really want to be happy inside. You really want to be happy inside. Be happy inside. Finally, they just say, stop harassing me. And then anytime someone says, be happy inside, I've heard that before. So you see, you must be careful for their own sake. It doesn't put you in the role of the parent and them in the child. Don't think that either. Just like, well, you'll be ready for these teachings someday. Again, the ego is so clever in twisting these things, so we have to be careful. It's easy, though, to outsmart all of these things by how? Just feel your heart. If your heart feels good in what you've said, if your heart feels good in what, after the interaction, take that as a good indication. If afterwards I said everything so clearly, it was excellent, but there's a pinch in the heart, then say, okay, you can either re-examine it or you can say better luck next time. Another option is the more you meditate, the more it's easier to have self-control. So even if somebody says something you can, let me choose how to respond. I was speaking to a man who, this was in Gorgon. It was a very strange situation, but I ended up having a 4-hour conversation with him because a taxi was late and there's something else and whatever. And I would have preferred it to be a 4-minute conversation, but it was from God. And he had read Autobiography of a Yogi when he was 9. He was terrified of dying as a child. And so he just kept, he was almost having panic attacks probably daily from being afraid of what if I die. And that's a whole other discourse. But so he got the book. Someone gave him the book. He read the book. I don't know how he read it at the age of 9, but he did. And then all that fear went away from him. And so he was telling me this, and I was saying, wonderful. He said, yes. And then I left all of that and became a Christian. And I just thought, okay, why did you have to leave all of that to become a Christian? I mean, you can actually do both things. I mean, you didn't have to, but okay, fine. And I said, all right, so yes. And then I had this wonderful church we go to. Oh, that's lovely. And, and all that. And now I'm an atheist. He wasn't saying that the church made him an atheist, but it was his other readings that, yes, that's the new religion, atheism. Okay, fine, I'll be an atheist. And so he started arguing and attacking religion, Christianity, yoga. Luckily, he didn't say Autobiography of a Yogi. Because no, I'm kidding. That would have been too far. But he was going after all these things, all the atheistical arguments that you can get. And I was starting to get tense because it was more and more untrue. But I knew that as soon as I went, that's not true, believe in God. Or if I had just said, love God, like Master did to someone, and it was right, of course, to say. But I knew if I just said no, he would say, see, you've become irrational. Something is true, it should be logical. And if you've become illogical, you're using that as a way out of the argument. I'm right. So I somehow knew that that's where he was going. And so I would, At one point, he went too far in slandering a great figure of religion. And I said, in this conversation, we will be respectful. And he said, okay. So that was the only time I said anything like that. But I kept praying to Master, if it's true that God exists, and everything he is saying is to prove that there is no soul, there is no goodness, there is no God, then there must be a logical flaw in his argument. Because if God is, and he's saying it isn't, then somewhere there must be some contradiction. And so I just have to listen long enough and see if I can find it. And Swamiji did this in the book Out of the Labyrinth with all these great Western thinkers. He answered them according to their own terms, their own logic. Here is the flaw in your argument, as opposed to just saying, look, this is ridiculous, and love God, which again would be our temptation, our tendency even. But it doesn't help them, and in fact it helps us. if we can find a way to expand our understanding to be able to answer someone in their own terms. It's also respectful to do so. Not respecting their religion of atheism in this particular case, but respecting their right to believe that way. He certainly had that right. He was trying to find out what was true. And that's part of what kept me in the conversation instead of, oh, you know, I have a call, and then just have to go. Because I could feel he had a good heart. And plus I was trapped, so I had the long conversation. My friend who brought him to me then said, you know, I have to go. And it was like, ah! Great. So, I rarely have this experience with guests personally. I don't want you to think if you see me that I'm going to be going. It was just this one guy. I mean, I felt okay for the first 3.5 hours, but by the end I was worn out. This was after tea, after lunch, after dessert, and then back again at the house again. So anyway, so he was saying things like, you know, it's good for society to have religion because it makes people behave. It brings social order. So religion isn't a bad thing, though completely false. It is not a bad thing because it keeps society easily. Otherwise, the police would have to do much more work. Oh, yeah. Great. And then he said, you know, smiles are not from kindness. Smile comes from the wolf. You see how wolves, they show their teeth. And so the human beings what happened was they would ever see another human being and they would go, just like the wolf. You know, it's all animals. We're all animals. And then they would see that the person coming was actually a friend, and they would go, They would change the mouth so as to remove the threat. And I decided, because this was his argument 17a, paragraph 6, you know, subport, I just thought, what's the point of arguing? But I thought to myself, how do you know? Were you there when the first caveman growled at someone and then went like this? Did you take a picture? Can I see it? How do you know? You know, you can make up anything. Smiles came from Mars. There was a guy who came from Mars and was like, hi, everyone. And they went, oh, what's they doing with his mouth? You mean you can say anything you want. It doesn't make it true. And you have to care what is true. So anyway, I was listening to this and saying, Master, please help me to answer him in his own terms. Because several times I went, I can't do it, because I will prove his point if I do. See, you can't discuss it calmly and emotionally. Unemotionally. He was trying everything. And then finally, it occurred to me, and I said, okay, that's fine. So if this is all true then, suppose you met another little boy who was the age of 9, just like you, and he was afraid of death. What would you say to him? And for the first time in the conversation, he went. There was silence. I said, you were afraid. You read Autobiography of a Yogi, which is full of God and all these things, and it brought you that peace. It worked for you. But if none of it is true, then how would you help someone with a similar problem, a 9-year-old boy? And he... And then he reached for one of the high priests of atheism, whose name I've forgotten, and he said, well, this man has said, the price I pay for maintaining my beliefs is that I have no words of comfort to offer the dying man. Fine. He was, it was fine. But after that, he was much more quiet, and then the taxi came. But he said, I loved this conversation because, whenever I talk with people, they just get upset. And I thought, really? But like I said, I could feel he had a good heart and that he was sincere. That's why I took the trouble, or again, and I was trapped. But he said they always tense up and they can't just answer back logically. So he finally admitted that yes, that was what he was thinking the whole time, that can you answer on a level of logic? And so he left. Wonderful conversation. We should meet again. Yes. I'm leaving town soon, which was true. I was. But anyway, I was very glad for that opportunity, because I have been in many arguments where the clever doubts I had no answer for, or they brought me down. And in one case in particular, I knew someone who I was arguing against who was my relative. That was hard. It's very hard, because you have shared love, and yet they're treading upon something that you find so precious. And even out of respect for you and love for you, couldn't they just at least keep quiet? If nothing else, couldn't they just keep quiet? Now, keep in mind, I hope we're also not saying, you smoke too much. You smoke too much. Just like, well, say it once or twice out of love, but then don't nag, because that's not going to help them necessarily. Maybe it will. Try it. But after a year or 6, then stop trying it. But this relative of mine, and I was at his house, so there was nowhere I could go, and I was staying overnight at his house, and so there was nowhere I could go, so he was constantly, and I kept coming. I would go every now and then to the washroom and just stand there and just kind of, okay, all right, so now if he tries that ploy, I'm going to counter with this, and then if he comes in that way, I can see that approach, so I'm going to say that. Then if he says this, I'm going to say, well, what about you? No, I better not say that, but okay. And then it suddenly came to me, you are going to lose. I knew I was going to lose the argument. This man is extremely brilliant. Perhaps one of the most brilliant people I know in terms of his intellect. And I suddenly realized, he's going to be able to outmaneuver me logically. Because what we're talking about is a subject of the heart, really. The heart is what knows. And so I decided that I was going to make a wall between my brain and my heart, temporarily. And so that no matter what my brain got confused by, I would not let it enter my heart. I would say, I'm going to get confused. My mind is going to become full of doubts because of his cleverness, but I am not going to let them enter my heart, because I know this is true. And I can't explain it to him. And in fact, we saw a movie recently where it said, it was about a saint, and it said, for those who believe in God, no explanation is necessary. For those who don't believe in God, no explanation is possible. And so that's the situation I was in with him. And so I went back in there and then just went completely, was, all the stops were taken away, and I was defeated. Why? Because he said, how do you know that the path you are on right now, doing all these things that you think are so good, how do you know that in 4 years you'll still believe any of it? How do you know you won't regret all this wasted time? How do you know? And don't say, that other people have done it, because that's not a good reason. And don't say you're smart, because that's not a good reason. How can you prove that this path will actually lead you to happiness and not misery when you find out it's not true? What could I say? Honestly, truthfully, how can you answer that? Because we don't know. We don't know what's going to happen in 2 years or 5 years or any number of years. I couldn't say categorically, and I have thought of other answers since then. I've had 10 years to go. Yeah, that's what I should have said 10 years ago. But I didn't have an answer. So I went away, and I was very shaken mentally, but I said, no, I'm not going to let it go down to my heart. And then I meditated on it, and I said, Master, what is the answer to that? I mean, it's a question, it has an answer, how do you answer it? And I realized that all I could say is, I have faith. I have faith. It doesn't mean I know for sure, but I have faith based on my own belief plus my own experience so far, in the years so far, that this is the right course for me. And on that faith, I can proceed. And if it turns out it's not, I can say, at least I was true to what I believed. At least I was loyal and followed and acted upon what I thought was true at the time. And if it turns out that it wasn't true, well, at least I was sincere. At least I was honest. Whereas it wasn't that he was living according to any philosophy. It's one of his famous statements, the Bhagavad Gita is nice, but that's not how you live your life. I thought, really? Isn't that what it's for? So anyway, God bless him. He's trying to find the truth in his own way and in his own time. And meanwhile, he helped me a lot, because my faith became much stronger after that, when I realized how precious and valuable it was. And also when I realized how impossible it is to transmit to someone else. So remember that. If you're seeking truth, if you're wanting God, if you're interested in any of these things, if you're sitting here today, or virtually sitting here today, it means you're interested in what is true, and you have enough belief to try it out, and you're building in your faith based on your experiences so far. And that's not something anyone can teach you. That's not something anyone can give you. No book, no person, no class. Nothing can give that. That has to be earned. Not in the sense of worthiness like earned, but earned through your own hard work and your own blessings. And so that which you have attained is a very precious gift, and honor that. And if other people don't understand it, fine. They may have faith in a different way, and that's fine. But realize the preciousness of it and the greatness of it, because it is the treasure that will lead you to freedom. God bless you all.